Okay, so the first thing we wanted to do today is just get a bit of a sense of, from the people attending, what your main concerns are about your students' well-being in the context of this pandemic and as in the current situation that we find ourselves in. So if you could go to menti.com and use this code, and I'll switch over to our Menti window while you're doing that. I'll just wait while you all get the code, and then we'll see those responses coming through and just get a bit of a read of the room. So that's 8327 546. And I'm going to switch over to our presentation here. And then hopefully, if I've done this right, oh no, can you see that? No, okay.
Sometimes you have to come out of share screen and go into a new share screen.
Yeah, I think normally I share my whole desktop, and for some reason I didn't do that today. So, sorry everybody. Okay, it's not very happy with me. Okay, can you see that now? Yes, brilliant, there we go. So yeah, your main concerns about students' wellbeing in the pandemic. Just give a couple of minutes for responses to come through there. So interesting, kind of varied things coming through so far. Definitely some issues that I know I've seen discussed an awful lot, so things like loneliness. Actually, there's real concerns right now about what the impact of this will be in terms of how students feel in relationships, and mental health, and also health more generally as well, I think is a really good point there. Anxiety about workload, and I think one of the things we'll touch on later today is definitely, that emphasis on schools catching up and that kind of language that's being used, and actually how that might come across to students is interesting conversations we've been having with people. Yeah, and I think some of the situations that students are in at home and the kind of impact of that coming up. Yeah, so I think some common themes around kind of, anxiety and worry about the future, and thinking about the kind of support that's in place around learning and the feelings that might be coming up around learning right now, and the health, the different kind of circumstances people are in at home, and those social elements as well. So there's quite a lot of, I'll come off this now, but do feel free to keep sharing in and we can dip back into this later. Let me move back to our presentation and hope this goes back smoothly again. Can you see the presentation now? Yes, brilliant, thank you everyone. Okay, so I swore I'd get more fluid by this within a year, but apparently not. So also I realised what I didn't do before was introduce us. So I'm Dr. Ola Dankovic. I'm a lecturer in psychology of education at the University of Manchester. And last year, when we started to see lockdown taking place, myself and some other colleagues who we've researched kind of different aspects, all of us different elements of kind of adolescent mental health, and the support around that and the particular experiences that are happening around that. And we were really interested, as lockdown kind of first happened last year and as the pandemic kind of started to become, increasingly a problem, what could we kind of add to understanding this from a kind of a young person's perspective. So we developed what we kind of consider a qualitative project, which is about where we try and understand kind of what something is like from an insider's perspective when we kind of We want to understand how something feels from the people in it. And that felt really important to us here. So we came up with the TEL study, Teenagers' Experiences of Life in Lockdown, and we set out to try and understand what this was like for older teenagers. So our findings that we're going to talk about now are specifically from 16 to 19-year-olds, but we do think that there's learning that goes beyond that specific age group and is kind of relevant to other teenage groups and young people as well. So the thing for us was, older teenagers facing this disruption during a really key stage in the transition to adulthood, when they're usually becoming a lot more independent, they're starting to plan for their futures and take steps for their futures and do exams and, enter the workforce. And we were very aware that these things were not happening in lots of ways for this age group. So we wanted to understand what lockdown looked like and what it felt like and how they were managing it. And so we set out to kind of understand what that felt like for them. So with thanks to the wider TEL study team, some of whom are here today, we'll kind of go through what we learned from this. And also we'll think about actually, what does this mean for educators? And we draw then not only on what we found here, but also I think, the wider expertise of our team, looking to Terry now as with his counselling in schools head on, and also the kind of wider evidence that's emerging in the theory that we understand is kind of relevant here as well. So just a quick overview of what we did. We asked 16 to 19-year-olds that were based in the UK to tell us about what lockdown looked like for them, what it felt like and how they were managing it. And we asked young people to kind of log in through this anonymous online portal and write about their experiences. So just over 100 teenagers shared their experiences with us. So obviously this is a kind of snapshot into what some teenagers of that age group were feeling at that time. In terms of the age, they were fairly levelly spanning that kind of 16 to 19 group. Most were girls and women. Most likely because of the nature of kind of writing about feelings, and all were in some form of education. So they're, as I said, this is very much intended as a kind of snapshot into some of the ways that teenagers are thinking about this, rather than a suggestion that this can kind of speak for all. Although I think many of our findings do resonate with some of the other projects that are happening at this time. So I'm going to show you, I'm not going to show you the full film. We made a 5-minute film that shares our findings, but I'm just going to show you the short version of that. The full version is on our website, just to give you a bit of a sense with a more, teenage voices rather than my own, about the kind of some of the key things that we learned here.
The COVID-19 pandemic has changed things for all of us, young people especially. In May 2020, researchers at the University of Manchester and Liverpool John Moores University asked 16 to 19-year-olds nationwide what lockdown felt like for them and how they were managing. Here's what they told us. This has been an emotional roller coaster. There's been a lot of intense feelings to deal with, feeling sad, worried and frustrated.
I was terrified of anyone I knew getting it, especially my sister, who suffers from asthma.
Our futures started to feel less certain, and we worried about grades, work experience and job opportunities.
When it was announced that GCSEs were cancelled, I was distraught.
Looking after our well-being has been especially important this year, and we've all been trying to figure out our own way of doing things, like creating goals and routine, spending time outdoors, staying active and learning new hobbies, trying to stay positive. We've been missing people outside of our homes, especially being together physically rather than just over the phone. There's been a sense of community during the pandemic, in our neighbourhoods, in our country, even across the planet. It can be reassuring to think that we are all in this together.
I'm okay now because I understand that it's the most important thing right now to help save lives.
So how can we all take care of ourselves? It's okay to feel angry, sad and confused. Try and find new things to do with your time so that you feel like each day is a little different. Stay in touch. You're not alone. Keep talking to friends and spend quality time with your loved ones if you can. This is not permanent and it won't last forever. There is light at the end of the tunnel.
So yeah, there is a longer version of that film on our website that gets into that in a little bit more detail, including some more advice for teenagers on caring for their well-being. But it's a nice little snippet there for you. no, don't start again. So I'm just going to tease out a couple of the kind of really key points, and then we'll jump into thinking about actually practically what does this mean for you know, people working in education with teenagers. So I think one of the biggest things was that this has been an emotional roller coaster, and there's been so much kind of change and loss and uncertainty. And I think that roller coaster process really is quite sums it up for a lot of the teenagers that we spoke with. And they did actually use those words quite a lot, that this was an emotional roller coaster. Keeping in mind this was in May last year, and I think many of us remember different versions of these kinds of feelings. I think, you know, some of these things are not necessarily only specific to teenagers. But yeah, so there were a lot of difficult feelings. Teenagers in our study described feelings of anger and frustration and sadness, and experiencing a lot of worry. Sometimes they said this was because of, you know, specific things that were changing, but actually sometimes they said they had a really hard time understanding why they felt the way they did, and that could be confusing. Participants were taking care of themselves using a lot of different strategies, and sometimes they were having to come up with new strategies. And some were actually coping quite well. So some did describe actually they did have some difficult feelings, but overall they were feeling okay, and there were positive elements as well, which we're going to touch on later on. But it hasn't always been easy, and actually there's been times when it was quite difficult for some teenagers to take care of themselves, either because they didn't feel they had appropriate strategies, or because they kind of lacked motivation to kind of, you know, get up and kind of take care of themselves, and some were just kind of staying in bed all day. And actually there was talk for some teenagers about the fact that they were using strategies that they didn't think might be healthy in some ways, but were working for them in others. So things like staying in bed all day actually was for some teenagers what they needed at that point in their eyes. Also things like binge eating and smoking as well, that they kind of said, actually this works for me right now, but I don't think it's a very good idea. And as I think many of us experienced, daily life changed a lot. I know I'm speaking to teachers in the room who, you know, had an enormous change that I think is unheard of in our time of school closures. You know, so teenagers talked about losing their routine, losing their kind of, you know, their daily purpose of what they were normally doing. They were, you know, trying to do work online. They were lacking independence. And I think, you know, that's something that normally is something that they really have at that point. And there was a loss of these kinds of normal teenage experiences, and they did often frame them that way. You know, it was the last day of school, it was prom, it was even just hanging out with their friends and doing exams of something that they'd worked towards for years. And they were these kinds of rites of passage they'd expected to happen that then just didn't, and can't kind of be replaced. They can't be gotten back, and that was quite a loss. And a lot of uncertainty about the future. Often things about kind of employment came up. How long this was going to just be their young adult years. So is it that all of their young adult years are going to be spent in this kind of socially distanced world where, you know, everything feels a bit smaller? So there was a lot of feelings and a lot of this kind of loss and uncertainty coming through. But there were things that were helping. So feeling connected was really important. Again, I think something that resonates with many adults. You know, having close, supportive interpersonal relationships did make lockdown feel either more positive, or it helped them manage when things were a bit trickier. But actually, most did still feel disconnected, even if they did describe having supportive relationships with parents or with friends. Many did also talk about feeling quite disconnected in other ways. So missing people that they couldn't spend time with that weren't in their household. Missing physical contact came up a lot. And I think, you know, they did talk about that idea that a phone is not the same. And I think it's very easy for us to assume that young people in particular were well equipped to deal with a move to remote interaction with other people. But actually, they all seemed to you know, agree that was not necessarily the same. And actually for some teenagers, that was actually very difficult. So, you know, instances of teenagers saying, I don't have the attention span to sit down and do a Zoom with my friends. So they're all just spending time without me. So actually there's cases where that was very difficult. And some did describe actually feeling quite isolated and quite kind of cut off from their wider social circle beyond their household. And some did describe kind of quite acute feelings of loneliness. Feeling that we're all in this together could make things easier. There was this kind of nice sense of community that sometimes came through. You know, they talked about doing things for elderly neighbours, like going to the shop for neighbours, and also feeling like other young people their age, and kind of the whole country was in this together, which was quite interesting because it did seem to help with some of the sacrifices they felt they were making. They felt like they could kind of rationalize that, yes, they were giving up their exams, but it was for this important thing. It was to kind of help save lives. And then an interesting point that came up, and I think, you know, is a positive for our project, of the fact that we were very open-ended in our questions. We didn't assume that this was going to be a difficult experience, and we did try and ask quite neutral questions. And certainly we did see that participants were describing positives. So even though they were experiencing these difficult feelings, many participants also talked about trying to find things they were feeling positive about. You know, that might be something that they felt grateful for. It might be kind of hope for the future. And lockdown also relieved some of the pressures of normal life, which I think was really, really interesting for us. And we'll talk later on about some of the implications of that for when we think about what schools can do. Because actually, you know, they talked about, even though they had all these difficult feelings, at the same time, they weren't having to worry about, you know, what they were wearing or saying the right thing or kind of, you know, keeping track of everything. There was this slower pace of life for them. And there were also opportunities to grow and develop. I know there was that cliche all last year of people making banana bread and learning to make bread and learning a new language. And, you know, this maybe is reflective of the fact that we spoke with teenagers when we did in May last year, when we were a couple of months in, but there was definitely this sense of kind of having new opportunities to grow and develop. And teenagers talked about learning to enjoy their own company and evaluating what they wanted out of their relationships and what they wanted out of life, and how they wanted to spend their day. Learning new skills. Many were learning a new language or learning some kind of new thing. And becoming closer with family, which is interesting, you know, not in all cases, because there were definitely instances where teenagers were in households with tensions and difficult relationships, but in many cases they described actually spending quality time with the people in their household in a way that they don't normally get to do. So there were definitely, you know, and these things do kind of coexist together in their experiences, that this is difficult and it's frustrating and there's a lot of losses, but at the same time there's these kind of lighter side of things happening. Terry, Emma, Kirsty, I don't know, before I move on to what schools can do, that's our very quick tour of our findings. Now you can read in more detail about what we found in our report on our website, which I'll flag at the end. But I don't know if any of you had anything else to add on that before I jump over to thinking about what schools can do.
I don't think I have anything to add, Ola. I think you've done a great job of summarising it.
I feel like I've gone through this summary many times now.
Thanks.
Okay, so now I'm going to jump over to thinking about, well, what does this mean for education staff and settings, and what can we actually be doing? And of course, we're very aware that school reopening happens hopefully forever on Monday, and that, you know, teachers are very much trying to kind of think about these things, which is why we wanted to kind of do this workshop. So folks, do, Terry and Emma and Kirsty, do just jump in on any of these slides if you've got any additional points to make, and I'll let you know as well to pop in with any thoughts. So a few kind of headlines, I suppose, from us, and then Kirsty's going to introduce some of the resources that we've identified as being helpful and some of the more practical strategies. But some kind of key points, I suppose, of thinking about is firstly, lockdown and school closures have been difficult for teenagers. I should say, actually, the guidance that we're offering here, obviously our study is with 16 to 19-year-olds, but we do think these points are quite relevant across secondary school education and also into college and university contexts also, that actually it does kind of span a little bit above and underneath that age group as well, because actually many of these points are coming up, and in other studies are coming up as quite similar across different age groups.
I was going to say, Ola, can I jump in there? And
Yeah.
just to point out, we've done a very similar study at John Moores with 11 to 14-year-olds, but we're asking them sort of broadly quite similar questions. And we've just been finishing the analysis for that, and actually the themes are very, very similar. So there's, you know, sort of slight nuances in socialising and things, but for the most part, their issues were the same.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. That's really, really helpful. And I think that's our kind of a key point for us, that, you know, we did speak with a very small amount of teenagers compared to the amount that there are in the whole country. But certainly we're seeing a lot of studies finding really similar aspects of this. And we certainly do draw on some of the wider discussions here that have been happening in these areas. So some of the things that we can be thinking about in schools is, you know, just firstly reminding teenagers who to talk to if they want support, making sure everybody's aware of support avenues within the school and that there are different opportunities and ways of accessing that. another point here is kind of encouraging teenagers to really openly talk about these experiences and reflect on how they've been taking care of themselves. Normalizing these feelings is really valuable, and certainly some of the responses we've had from teenagers who have watched the Tell Study film is they felt less alone from knowing other people are feeling that way. So I think it does make me wonder how often all teenagers are actually having those conversations with each other and seeing that they're not alone with those feelings. That for some teenagers, they might not always realise that it's normal to be having the reaction that they are. And I know, Terry, we've had conversations about that fact that, you know, the feelings that teenagers were having in response to that last year is it's not necessarily, we don't always need to worry about resolving those feelings. It's just providing an outlet for them and empathising.
Yeah, no, I suppose to add to that, it's kind of thinking about the kind of therapy relationship more broadly. I guess a lot of what I would do as a counsellor is offering that space to kind of for people to talk. And I think often sort of therapy is an unnatural kind of response to things that cannot sometimes happen naturally within other settings. And I think what we're really keen to kind of encourage is there's lots of young people who will want to talk and want to sort of share their feelings, and it's kind of trying to provide spaces or support people in talking about their experiences. I don't know how to describe it, but I suppose the term normalizing sort of sums it up in some ways. This is a normal response to kind of an adverse event in many ways.
Yeah, and I know one of the things here is obviously thinking about the fact that certainly there are a lot of concerns about mental health at the moment, but I think for many teenagers, they don't, you know, not everybody's going to need kind of extended one-to-one support, you know, even having, you know, group opportunities to talk about this together, you know, for some teenagers that may well be enough. So it's about, you know, whereas some teenagers may need more of that kind of one-to-one help. So it is kind of thinking about how can we have different opportunities to have these conversations with teenagers and kind of be responsive to what their needs are. I don't know, Terry, you know more about that than I do. I don't know if I explained that clearly.
I think you did a great job, probably clearer than I was before. So,
and also I know a really key point here is that actually one thing we also need to think about is how support is in place for staff as well, because actually, you know, we know that staff often can find it difficult to have, you know, to be the person providing this support, this emotional support to their students. That, you know, some people do find that more challenging, and that can also feel like it can be a lot of emotional labor. And I think particularly, you know, with so many teenagers having, you know, going through this same big thing together and all having different kind of needs at this time, that actually providing that support could be quite difficult. So making sure that there is appropriate kind of support in place, there's opportunities for staff to kind of reflect and kind of offload some of their feelings around that as well, and that there's access to any training that they feel like they may need to assist with that.
This was a point that I'd sort of, you know, really flag home in you know, in talking to a group of teachers. I guess, you know, I think often, again, as working as a therapist, it would be commonplace for me to kind of have at least an hour and a half of reflexive time, not line management, but talking about the kind of the types of issues that people might share with us, to kind of unpack that and look after myself. And I think it's not as embedded in the culture, I guess, of kind of more pastoral activities within schools. And I think we're really keen that people kind of look after themselves, and you know, we don't neglect the needs of teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. Emma or Kirsty, I don't know if you've got anything else to add before I jump across to the next slide. Okay. Now, balancing priorities, I know that we're far from the first people to be bringing this up right now. This is everywhere at the moment around what should schools be worrying about right now. And I'm sure, you know, all of you as teachers are very aware of this. So certainly we are seeing that schools, you know, that there is pressure for schools to think about focusing on learning. There's a lot of talk of that kind of academic catching up. We, and I think many other people, you know, in various different professions in and around this, both teachers and researchers and other kind of professionals here are, you know, many are advocating more for a kind of social engagement focus in returning. So, you know, if what children need is to play, what teenagers need on coming back is that time to just kind of come back in slowly, and to have that time with friends and kind of, you know, make up for lost social time more than catching up on academic learning per se. And that we really need to think about kind of, I suppose, how schools can embed that into their day. while still balancing some of the other pressures that are in place, which I appreciate is a tricky thing right now. So that might include, you know, reconnecting with friends, and actually in some settings, teenagers actually haven't physically met the peers that they've been working with, you know, and doing remote learning with. So actually not just reconnecting with friends, but actually connecting with friends for the first time in some cases. And rebuilding social skills. We did actually hear concern from the teenagers in our study, and I know that that's come through in other work as well, that actually some teenagers are quite worried that they might have lost some of their social skills during this time, and talk about worrying about being more socially awkward after this. Now, I think we don't have a good understanding yet of whether or not there are developmental implications of school closures for teenagers in this particular regard, but certainly it's something that teenagers themselves are worrying about, and it's something that they feel they want. And that kind of concern around that seems in and of itself important, to make sure that they have that space. And it was, you know, it's been an emotional loss to not be able to just kind of freely spend time with friends. Easing students back into school may take time, and I think certainly patience is going to be important. I know Gavin Williamson in a statement this week said something about behaviour and discipline being a priority, and I think certainly, you know, the teenagers that we spoke with last May, even at that early point, they'd lost all sense of, you know, routine. Teenagers normally have a routine handed to them a lot of the time, and actually there was a need to kind of manage themselves in a way that is quite unfamiliar, and I think returning to that kind of system of, you know, being very structured is actually going to be quite challenging for many students. So I think that kind of easing back in gently will be quite valuable. Obviously, we hope that the need to be doing quarantining won't go on for too much longer, or won't be at the level that it was in the previous kind of level of open schools. But continuing flexibility and patience during that time. Now, we do have, and I know Kirsty, I don't know if you touch on this later on, we do have on the, as part of our resources, a document we made about supporting wellbeing during remote learning. Kirsty's nodding, so I think she's going to talk about that a little bit later on anyway. But yeah, that kind of continuing to have that flexibility. I know, as you know, some of this is stuff that I know teachers are very aware of, that, you know, students have been unable to access things equally. And that actually some do find this much more difficult than others to be doing remote learning, and actually there are kind of wellbeing considerations there around providing that support. Transparency in decision making is, I think, a thing that's important for any communication, either from schools or from government or from anywhere else right now, in terms of, you know, teenagers have lost a lot of feeling of control in the last year, and I think there are times when, you know, especially at the moment when schools are having to put new practices in place all of a sudden, you know, to respond to some of the kind of health issues and the kind of requirements of schools being open. So I think a really key thing is that kind of transparency in explaining decisions, and where possible involving students in those, to kind of give them back that little bit of feeling of, you know, being part of the decisions and being in control of what's happening day to day. So that might even be about, you know, safety protocols and exactly why they need to be in place in the way that they do. Certainly in thinking about, you know, the communications that teenagers are receiving about exams, there's been very little consultation with them around that. So I think having, you know, opportunities to make clear and explain how the schools are approaching that will be really helpful. Terry and Emma and Kirsty, I don't know if you've got anything else to add on these points. Nope. Okay. Yeah, so providing support for the future. We were very aware of there's a kind of multifaceted issue around teenagers' concerns about the future right now, because some of this is about, you know, exams being cancelled, and I know that there is continuing uncertainty for teenagers about exactly what the replacement systems for that look like. So providing that reassurance, you know, we know that schools are often working with career services to provide that future support. So I think really reminding students frequently that that support can be in place and is in place. And thinking about, you know, how can schools kind of provide support to students who are thinking about their future plans? Because actually, some of the concerns we saw from teenagers in the study, it was this kind of long-term impact they were fearing. So, you know, even as simple as I didn't get to do this work experience, and so it won't be on my personal statement for university, so I won't get into this kind of career and I'll just never do this. And it was this kind of, you know, quite big fears that came out of what seemed like small losses on the surface. And certainly it might be helpful to think about how career service engagements, can actually be increased this year, especially, with thinking about the fact that the unemployment issues that we're seeing do seem to be hitting young people quite hard. And some of the industries that young people are very present in terms of things like the hospitality industry and, theatre and arts, that we're seeing quite concerning issues within those industries. And that was something that was starting to creep up in our responses from teenagers last year. They're at that point when they're making decisions about what they want to do with their future, and actually there's just a lot of uncertainty at the moment. So being able to engage with a little bit more career support for some may be very helpful. Again, thinking about that kind of catastrophizing that some teenagers might be doing, of this thing has happened and so that thing is going to happen and now all of my life is kind of ruined. Actually, it might be helpful to kind of help teenagers, I suppose, bring that control focus down to something a little bit more short term. So actually having, school-based plans and goals for the year so that they're working towards something that feels a little bit closer. And certainly, I suppose, if we're thinking about, returning to school and easing back in gradually, thinking about what they want to get from the next few months might be quite helpful in thinking about orienting back into that as well. And also encourage future thinking that, where that's a little bit more controlled. And again, clear and transparent discussion about exams and grading. We know that teachers providing that grading, that was a very new experience last year, and I'm sure very difficult. And I think having those conversations with students about this and how they feel about this will be really, really useful. There were definitely teenagers in our study who kind of felt like, well, either they'd done not very well earlier on and they were really working hard to kind of get back up and get their grades up, and then that wasn't going to be recognised. And some teenagers as well who thought that their teachers didn't think very well of them, and they were very worried about being graded in that way. So I think, having space to have conversations about that will be really useful. Again, Terry, Kirsty, Emma, I don't know if you've got anything to add there.
Nothing to add, really. I think it's one of those things about thinking about, one of the surprises was the link with careers in some ways, and how far these people were kind of thinking forward. I think often we sort of think of mental health and well-being as being more about the kind of psychological aspect, but there were lots and lots of practical aspects that might be some of the kind of almost too obvious things that were kind of being told to us by young people that we need to consider as well.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things that the level of uncertainty and fear that they had about the future was actually very intense. And I think that in itself, it becomes a well-being issue, even though you think of it as quite separate. But actually, it was creating a lot of difficult feelings. So it's certainly a really interesting point there. Another kind of, so as we noted before, actually, there were positives in lockdown, and I know that there's been lots of talk around, what is the new normal going to be like after COVID? And that's been talked about in basically every aspect of everything over the last year, of what's the new normal going to be. We do think it was quite interesting that, even with all of the distress that lockdown and a pandemic brought, there were fears I'm still stuck on fears about the future in my brain then. There were actually positive experiences as well. So even with all of that distress, in some ways, this was still better than normal teenage life. They talked about not having to worry about doing the right thing, and, not having the kind of pressure on them that's normally there, and not having had this time and space to themselves before. It's quite interesting. It raises questions about what they're normally experiencing, that was such an intense relief for them. So it's quite interesting, I suppose, to think about, are there opportunities for us to be having conversations with teenagers about what a new normal might look like for them, and what can we take from this, and what do they want to preserve that they've gained out of this time? If it's that they've been spending more time with their family and they've really liked that, how can they think about continuing with that? If they've learned a new language or learned to make bread, or something that they've gotten out of this, how can we kind of celebrate that and encourage them to think about how they take these decisions that they made for themselves forward? But also, are there ways of us thinking in normal life about how we replicate some of that? Is it that it's, giving them more opportunity to make decisions for themselves in certain aspects, or kind of finding opportunities to relieve some pressure. Now, I'm aware that the pressures that are on teenagers are certainly not something that most schools are in control of. You know, there's a kind of a broader pressure that schools are under here. And so I am aware that, you know, this can't be something that's necessarily fixed at an individual school level, and there's a need for a kind of bigger conversation about some of the pressures that are present in secondary education, you know, things like the pressure of exams. But certainly discussion at local and national level could be quite interesting to have these conversations with teenagers now that they've seen this other way of doing things, to explore whether or not there are opportunities that they think this could be kind of carried into some of the ways that things are happening in their school or in their setting. Again, Terry, Emma, Kirsty, I don't know if you've got anything else to add on that. It's certainly an interesting one, but I think is difficult when we know that schools do face a lot of pressures.
I know another piece of research that we've been doing with the online counselling service, Kooth, has sort of also echoed sort of similar findings around kind of, you know, things like exam stress plummeting, you know, understandably in some ways, but then issues of loneliness increasing. So it's kind of thinking about unpacking some of these stories with a view to what does it tell us about what we're doing to these individuals, and can we learn anything from it, I guess. Lots, I'm sure we're all thinking about at this point in time.
Yeah, it's really interesting that this is something that they felt, and I think it is a good moment to kind of pause and have these conversations with them, but, you know, thinking about how that can be done in a way that kind of fits with some of the wider issues that are in play. Now, the final point before I hand over to Kirsty to walk through some of the resources that we've identified is that several participants did feel quite frustrated and angry with the government for the way that the pandemic had been handled. And some felt that their age group in particular had been overlooked. Now, this, as it, again, was in May last year. And I know that following this in the summer, there was a lot of you know, media coverage and discourse about young people that was quite negative. So I would have been interested to see how teenagers felt after that period also, but certainly some did feel overlooked. So I think the key point for us here is understanding that students may be angry and they may be frustrated, especially now, you know, this has been going on for a year. It's a big chunk of their experiences, their time. So understanding that actually those feelings may be there for them. And for professionals, thinking about how, you know, you can use your professional voice to inform others about difficulties teenagers are experiencing, how we can advocate for them. And I think both at an individual level and more widely, you know, getting involved in campaigns that challenge some of the policies that affect children and young people. And there's things like the I Will campaign that's very good for that, and thinking about how we can involve ourselves and also the young people that we work with in some of those campaigns as well, and encourage that kind of vocal advocating against some of the issues that we're seeing there. So Kirsty, I'm going to hand over to you at this point. I don't know if you had wanted to share your screen as well. I think I've made you a host, so you should be able to if you need
to. Okay, well, that just override your screen then. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that works for me.
Okay. So yeah, I'm just going to talk you through then some of the resources that we have pulled together and developed, drawing on the findings of the TEL study. And some of the aspects that Ola has mentioned earlier. So I think this was your slide, Ola. This wasn't one.
Sorry, Kirsty. Yeah. To you. Yeah. So we received some funding after we'd finished the main project to develop some resources. So the first thing we did was we made that video for teenagers that explores the kind of findings. As I said, the full version of that is on the website, and we have been getting some feedback from teenagers about how they've found engaging with that seems quite positive. And we've also, or Kirsty rather, has taken the lead on creating a free online toolkit for education staff and settings that are supporting teenagers during the pandemic. And the website for that is, I'm now realising incorrect there. It should say www.seed.manchester.ac.uk TEL toolkit, but I'll pop any links in the chat at the end of this session as well. So that includes a small number of new resources that Kirsty has led on developing, but also includes signposting to wider resources. So there was a lot of stuff being made in the last year around kind of things that education staff could be doing and ways we can support teenagers. So we didn't want to kind of reinvent the wheel when actually there's some really good stuff coming out. But what we wanted to do was kind of create a way that education staff could navigate some of those resources based on key issues that are coming up. So we've got a kind of toolkit that allows staff to navigate different issues and think about what they can do there. And those particular themes that we identified were based on the challenges that teenagers told us they were experiencing, as well as some emergent findings more widely as well. So Kirsty, is now the time to jump to you.
Just trying to throw me there. Yes, so I'm just going to talk you through then and show you some of these resources, and obviously we'll share all the links with you so that you can have a proper look in more detail. So first of all, the first thing that we have put together then is this toolkit. So we've collated the resources that are out there. Obviously, no point reinventing the wheel, and there was lots of really useful things out there that would complement what we also developed. And we looked at the key, some of the key themes from the findings. So they broadly come under these here. So I'm just going to show you then the screen. Let's see. There we go. So this is the toolkit. Everyone can see that okay? Yeah. And then there's obviously within this, the video that Ola showed you earlier, which is the starting point for some of the discussions that the lesson plan, which I'll talk to you in a minute about, uses. So as you can see here then, these are the broad categories that we've kind of grouped the resources under based on the findings. And it was really interesting to see that some of these were things that were identified at the beginning as well. So obviously what teachers are finding and what education staff are finding are in line then with what we found in the TEL study and with what teenagers have told us. So at the top of each section, if you click on them, we've included a little bit of a blurb about the specific finding that the content relates to. So things like mental health and well-being will be quite quite obvious and quite clear. And then obviously you'll have the resources here. And there's a range of information, strategies, lesson ideas, and training themes as well. So other aspects then are things around change and uncertainty. So obviously there's a lot of transition happening, and young people are returning to school, so there might be a lot of uncertainty and change around that. Motivation and engagement. So I know there's been a mixture of how young people have engaged with learning since before Christmas. So some education staff are saying that there's been quite good online engagement, and some there's been less. So hopefully, there's some resources in there to help with re-engaging young people with education and getting motivated again. And as some of the TEL findings found, it's obviously difficult when your plans for the future have been disrupted and exams have been cancelled and things like that. So it might be hard then to get motivated and to be engaged with learning. So things around relationships again. So obviously a key point that came out is around loneliness and times of social distancing. How can we stay connected? So it's useful just to be having these discussions with young people about the importance of this. Self-care strategies then. So obviously, some teenagers told us that they were things they were doing to take care of themselves, and there are also different suggestions for self-care strategies around that as well. So some might be it might be a useful sharing experience for those ones who have come up with these kind of strategies, and then for others there might be ideas there for them. Physical health, which I noticed came up at the beginning as well. Media and government, and then also support for staff and support for parents and carers, which was something that was highlighted by Terry and Ola at the start as being an important aspect as well. So hopefully, lots within there that can be used and will be useful drawing on some of the themes from the study. So we also have developed lesson plan and a PowerPoint to go along with that. I'll just click on it. Hopefully you'll be able to see this here. So again, the idea around this is to be really adaptable and flexible, understanding that learning is happening in lots of different ways. And, you know, as a previous teacher myself, I obviously understand the pressures that school are under at normal times, and especially during this time as well. So we wanted to make something that could be really flexible and could be used in a range of ways. So it's generally based around 4 core activities, and these are based on some of the themes that we talked about. So reflecting on lockdown and talking about and, you know, validating and normalizing, as Terry had said earlier, some of these feelings and experiences that young people will have gone through. So there's obviously going to be quite a varied difference between what young people have experienced. So it's important to have this kind of chance for them to reflect and discuss these. Thinking about change, loss and uncertainty, again, you know, we've talked about the fact that exams are cancelled, that plans for the future might have changed, you know, things have just not been in the last year what we might have expected when it was the start of last year. So, you know, coming to terms with that a little bit and thinking about the moving forward with that as well. Coping and self-care. So as Ola highlighted earlier, young people told us that there was a range of kind of coping strategies which were healthy and unhealthy that they were relying on to get them through, which I'm sure is, you know, the same for a lot of people. So it's just having some discussions around what is a healthy coping strategy, what is unhealthy, maybe even creating sort of action plan for the future. So it's, you know, helping them to develop skills in this area, which will be helpful, not just with the pandemic situation, but also in thinking about their mental health and well-being as they move forward. And then the last one is obviously connecting with others, which is what we've been talking about, who they can talk to. It's useful for signposting within the school and outside organisations, and just generally, you know, how they might connect with others, which might be something that's been lost a little bit in this time where we're being constantly told to stay away from other people, and you know, there's kind of messages around social distance and things like that. So the idea is that they could be used standalone, or as a complete lesson, or really just to fit in as and when schools or colleges and universities feel they can. And then there's a range of extension activities drawn on some of the other key points around government and information that young people get. So obviously one of the findings is they can be quite overloaded by you know, the information that they get, and how to sort of engage with that in a more kind of healthy and focused way, I guess. So as Ola also mentioned, we have created this guidance for supporting, can everyone see that as well? I'm not sure when yeah, for supporting wellbeing during remote learning. So hopefully as we move back into school and college and, you know, more face-to-face interaction, we will have less remote learning, but I can't imagine it's going to vanish, you know, immediately. So there's still a need to think about how that's going to be supported, you know, when bubbles burst or, you know, outbreaks happen in schools and things. So, you know, there's a little bit of thinking around that as well, how to support that too. And hopefully some of the aspects of the lesson plan can also be done remotely as well, thinking about reflection and kind of their reflecting on their experiences and connecting with others. So I think, yeah, that's pretty much everything I was going to say on that. If anyone, if Ola or Terry or Emma wanted to add anything, or I think the best thing to do is probably to go on, have a look at it, and we're also, if you do use these resources, we've got a short survey, which I'm sure Ola will maybe mention at the end as well, just to get feedback on this. And it's something that we're constantly updating. So as new things come out and as times change, hopefully, you know, we can add more things onto the toolkit and adapt the resources sort of in line with that.
Yeah, so what we've tried to do with the toolkit is not add everything that's available because there's so much, but certainly to be responsive to new issues that are coming up and kind of trying to compile in things that might be helpful as you know, things change. So I'll jump back to my slides. Thank you, Kirsty. Really nice to see it kind of being walked through. Can you see my slides again? Yeah, brilliant. So I did just want to flag just the last sort of minute or so before I'll stop recording and cut to questions in a moment. Some of the feedback we have been getting from teenagers who have engaged with the film, just to highlight, actually that is a key part of the lesson plan, is getting them to really reflect on watching that and thinking then about their own experiences. And we have seen kind of positive responses. So realizing that they're not the only one going through this is really reassuring, and something that they're getting from watching that. Several people saying it's advice they've heard before, but actually getting it from other teenagers and knowing it's come from other teenagers being really valuable. And we do know there is our kind of advice briefing that does share, you know, it is just a briefing that's sharing lots of wellbeing advice from our participants. And also, helping, knowing that other people are feeling the same way about all of these changes that are happening, and especially as kind of education things continue to change, knowing that they're not alone. So the website, the correct website, is www.seed.manchester.ac.uk/tell, and you can add -toolkit to the end of that to get to our education staff toolkit. And we're also on Twitter. We do have an opportunity to feed back on the toolkit on the website, and that is on the toolkit website. We're using that to understand how teachers are using the toolkit, understanding from that what are teachers finding helpful and what's actually working for them, and also identifying ways for us to develop the toolkit further as teachers' needs continue to change. So do pop onto the survey. It should take about 10 to 15 minutes, I think, at most. We tried to make it, you know, minimally burdensome because, you know, we know you've got lots on at the moment. So I'm going to jump across to questions, and I'm going to stop recording there just so that people can kind of chime in with any questions that they've got if they'd like to. So I will stop recording there for anybody watching remotely afterwards.